Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Content Manager at Goodlord, and this session is a recording of our webinar, What Can Agents Do About Unsustainable Pressures in the Private Rental Sector? Goodlord CEO William Reeve led the session, and he was joined by Megan 18, Business Development Manager at Haslams, and Robert Bolwell, Senior Partner at Dutton Gregory. The three speakers share their insights and expertise on a range of topics, including the Renters Reform Bill and making tax digital, as well as sharing some advice on how to overcome some of these market challenges. So without any further ado, let's crack on with the podcast.
Morning, everybody, and welcome to our latest webinar here from Goodlord, talking about what agents can do about the unsustainable pressures in the private rental sector. So those of you who don't know Goodlord is a software platform that provides the best way to progress lettings deals remotely. Has a whole variety of features, starting at the point of signing landlords up to the terms of business, generating contracts, e-signing payments, handling deposits, collecting rent, all the way providing agents with automated compliance reporting, as well as extra services. Our latest one being the all bills included feature that we launched last summer. But I'm not here to provide a sales pitch. I'm really here to help agents understand the pressures going on in the sector. So we're hoping to be joined here by two esteemed guests. One of them I think is just dialing in, but might turn to Megan to introduce herself.
Hello, thanks for having me. So I work at Haslams Estate Agents in Reading as a business development manager. I also have joined the ALA advisory panel, so do a lot of work behind the scenes there. Been in the industry for around 15 years, and my job here at Haslams is to streamline the processes, do a bit of training, but ultimately try and win new business for the team.
Super, thank you. We're very lucky to have you join us. Thank you. We definitely are expecting Robert, unless some disaster has fallen. So, but I think in the meantime, let's kick off. So if I just jump to slide 5, we've got 6 things to talk about today. We're going to just kick off and talk a little bit about our recent initiative to write an open letter on behalf of literally hundreds of people, actually, regarding these unsustainable pressures. We'll give a quick update around making tax digital. Then we'll look at the Renters Reform Bill, the latest news and what from that and what to expect on that. And then we'll dig in a bit on what advice we have for landlords, how we should be adapting agencies, or agencies should adapt against market shocks. And finally, we'll try and close on some of the positives of the changes going on in the market at the moment. Robert, I can see you're nearly with us. I'm just going to push on in the meantime, though. So let's, for those of you who've not been following it, I just want to talk a little bit about the open letter that we have. I'm going to jump on, I think, 2 slides, please, Sarah. So we have Goodlord led an initiative a few weeks back to write a letter publicly to the Minister of State for Housing, the then Minister of State for Housing, one might note. And this was really just highlighting how a lot of the pressures in the industry with sort of lack of stock, landlords leaving the market, rents shooting up, a lot of stress for tenants and applicants, are not sort of acts of God, but actually stem directly from government policies. And we were calling for recognition that actually some of those policies are sort of driving some of that pressure. We were very thrilled, really, to see the level of support for that letter. I'll just jump on a slide, please, Sarah. We actually have had now over 1,000 people join, show their support and add their name to the letter, which we delivered the physical version back in Christmas, but with the letter still public, still gaining support. I think we're just approaching 1,100 signatories from all across the space: letting agents, landlords, industry suppliers, and a whole range of people from all the parts of the United Kingdom. So there's been a lot more noise and awareness, I think, of some of these dynamics, and I think we've been very grateful for that support. And some of those themes that we'll be touching on later on in this webinar. Might be a good time to just introduce Robert. Welcome, Robert. Thank you for joining. Do you want to just sort of say a few words about an introduction for those people who are new to you?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Some of you may know me already. I'm a partner with Dutton Gregory Sisters, and I guess most of my working life is spent sorting out landlord and tenant issues. So, having looked at what Goodlord has done, having looked at the impetus behind the changes, I think, we all need to get on board. We all need to make our opinions known to government, whether it's your local MP or at slightly high levels of Goodlord are doing. I welcome everything we can do to try and impress upon government the importance of the private rented sector, and how that, what they have to do or not do is anything to upset the proverbial apple cart. So, yeah, I'm all for it, William.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, and we've had some people asking kind of why was Goodlord getting so involved in this, and I think it stems really from what Goodlord's mission is to make the renting experience better for everybody involved with it, and we're fortunate now to be involved with a lot of the activity going on in the UK. We see a lot of the activity. We can see firsthand really how much of the stress and pressure the market's under. So just, I know some people have been asking that offline. I thought I'd just give a bit of context there. But last time we had one of these webinars with Robert, we were talking about making tax digital. So I just wanted to give a quick update on it, because there's been quite a bit of news on that since we last spoke. So let's jump on to slide 9, please, Sarah. Robert, do you want to just, sorry, this is a new slide, but I think hopefully pretty self-explanatory. Do you want to just sort of set out what's changed since we last spoke?
Just talk you through it. I mean, most of you probably know that coming in the not too distant future, you'll have to file your tax returns, not with a bit of paper like we've done for generations, but literally you'll do it online using software which is compatible with what the revenue is at the moment. If you are in a business where you file a VAT return every quarter, you will probably be aware that from last year, from about November of last year, you had to do that digitally. You could not do it on a bit of paper. Well, that is coming to the landlord sector. Originally, it was going to be something like 2023. Then they pushed it back to April of 2024. The latest pronouncement from the revenue is that digital taxation will come to landlords in April of 26. Now, originally, when they were talking about this, it really meant that landlords had to file not just their annual return online, but they had to file a quarterly return, just like a VAT return. And it would apply to any landlord who had a rental income of 10K a year or more. Now, if you think about it, you don't need many properties in your portfolio to go beyond that threshold. So the latest suggestion is that from April of 26, that threshold for landlords will be 50K. But it's not 50K just in rental income, it's 50K in income from your business or from your rental portfolio. So watch this space. 2026 is when it's all going to happen. To be honest, and I know I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to politics, the numbers may change, the date may change. So just keep reading your updates from Goodlord, keep going on these seminars, because when it changes, yeah, I'm sure William and the others at Goodlord will let everybody know. Yeah,
super. Thank you very much for that, Robert. Anybody on the webinar, by the way, who's got questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and very happy to take questions as we go, and we will we'll also be have a bit of time at the end for them. But yeah, let's turn to the Renters Reform Bill. So this has been in the works for quite a while. Robert, I might ask you to just sort of, so what's the latest state of play on this? When can we expect this, do you think?
Well, nobody really knows. I mean, you say it's been in the wind for a long time. It has. I mean, if we go back to, 2017, there was talk then about scrapping the Section 21 notice, and that is the headline element of the reforms the government wants to bring in. And they are reforms that at the moment, at least so far as Section 21s are concerned, are supported by every major political party out there. So some people may say it'll never happen. It will happen at some stage, Section 21s again. But you're right to raise the question, William, when is it going to happen? And to be honest, we don't really know. It was the early summer of last year, we had the white paper, which is going to form the basis of the Renters Reform Bill. And at that stage, they were talking about getting the bill out for us all to have a look at sometime within a 12-month period. Then that slipped back to September of this year, September 23. And when Michael Gove last was quizzed on this, I think on the Today programme, actually, on BBC Radio 4, he said by the end of 24, in other words, by December of 23, he's likely to have that bill. Now, the problem I've got, William, is that it may have cross-party support in its embryonic stage, but when MPs and those in the House of Lords start looking at the bill in detail, you can probably say it's going to be the best part of the year to get through all the stages the bill has to get through before it becomes law. Now, If it becomes law before an election, well, that's fine. It'll be on the statute book sometime, probably in 2025. But if it doesn't make it through Parliament by the time this Parliament comes to an end and we have a general election, well, all bets are off. So if we do get the bill introduced in December of 23 and it's passed into law in 24, fine. But of course, we all know that we're going to have an election sometime before the first weeks of January 25. So, it's a bit up in the air. But what I would say is, because it's got cross-party support, at least the White Paper's got cross-party support in some respects, those Section 21s will go. And what, of course, we don't know is whether it'll be Michael Gove's department that gets the reforms done, or whether it might be the new government. I mean, of course, if there's a new government, we don't at the moment know what colour that new government is going to be. So it's all a bit up in the air.
Just actually on that point, there's a question around the Making Tax Digital from Jonathan Challis, just wondering, does Labour have a view on that, or can we assume there's some bipartisan support for the Making Tax Digital as well?
For the main issues, yes, it's got bipartisan support. And if we go back to the tax thing, the idea the government doesn't really want to catch accidental landlords, I think the last slide said. But of course, when you file your digital tax return, you're going to have to be sort of estimating what your tax is going to be, and it will probably speed up the collection of revenue from poor old landlords. And of course, in that respect, it will have, again, cross-party support, just like the Section 21 thing does. Whether other elements of the Renters Reform Bill will get quite the same degree of cross-party support, we don't know. And the reason we don't know is we don't actually know what the Renters Reform Bill is going to contain. If it follows the line of the White Paper, literally to the letter, yeah, there may be some MPs will object to it. Most MPs think it's wonderful, even if they do come from the other parties. What we do have at the moment, though, is a bit of a committee made up of those from the industry, National Residential Landlords Association, Property Mark, government departments. They have this cross-party committee looking at what was suggested in the White Paper. They published their latest report a week or so ago, and one of the things they homed on are students, because you may recall in the White Paper, they said whilst the rest of us will be dealing with periodical rollover tenancies, they might still keep fixed-term tenancies for students in purpose-built student accommodation. Well, I don't quite understand the logic of students having to be in purpose-built accommodation to be accepted from that part of the proposals. But, and that's been criticised by the committee. So before we actually get to the Renters Reform Bill, there will be lots of tinkering with the ideas at grassroots level. So again, just watch the space.
Great. And do you see any signs for hope on the long-term agenda that something will be done to even out the balance between demand and supply?
Well, if we go back to Boris Johnson, I mean, he famously came up with a figure of 300,000 new homes every year. That's what we need to build effectively to get supply and demand in equilibrium. And I think if we were building 300,000 homes a year, yeah, I could say great opportunities for people who are building, people who are selling, but we're not. I mean, at the moment, the last year of which figures are available is the financial year 21-22. And in that year, it was about 204,000 new homes we built. So even in our best year for ages, we are 30% less than we should be building. Now, if you think about what that means for the private rented sector, it means there's always going to be an imbalance between those who need property, need homes, need somewhere to rent, and what's available. So being quite mercenary about it, if I was a landlord at the moment, I'd be quite optimistic about where my rental levels might be 2, 3, 4 years from now, because we're just not building the homes people need. So I don't think there's any clear sign that we'll get to equilibrium anytime soon, not unless we have a massive change in policy. We do, as you alluded to at the beginning, we have a new housing minister. She's been in the job less than a month. Whether that will mean a change in government policy, whether we'll get more targets, more pressure to build homes, I really don't know. It's always a question of cash, and this government doesn't have much. Yeah,
very helpful. Thank you. Then we might turn a bit more to look at what the impact on the ground of this is. And Megan, I'm looking for a bit of help on sort of on the commentary here. We asked for the people who've signed up to support the open letter. We asked them if for any suggestions on policy recommendations for them, and this is what we found from that. Taxation very much top of the list, and even for people who think that actually they want some changes in the rental reform bill. So most of the changes they're looking for there appear to be tax related. Though there are some other suggestions here around government reviews, encouraging more supply and incentives for that, and looking at what they're requiring from an EPC front. But Megan, when you had a look at these data, is this what you expected? Any surprises here?
No, I think is the honest answer is no. I think when we actually spoke before the webinar, we said, you said, what would you do if you had a magic wand, Megan? And I said, I think we'd have to sort the tax issues out. So it doesn't surprise me that the fellow agents on this call felt the same. So taxation is a massive part. I think for me, the pejorative language that's being used when discussing landlords at the moment within the media, within the political parties, does not help the cause at all. So it does put us in that position where we're having to almost defend the undefendable. And I think if people could really see a full picture on what a landlord actually is, it isn't just somebody that's in a nice suit who's full of bags of money. And I think if we start flipping the dial on that, we might see that we'll have a bit more of a chance. But as Robert so eloquently put, we're very far off that, which is, it's alarming.
Absolutely. And Robert, you mentioned the student dynamics around purpose-built housing, but this point around offsetting expenses, do you want to just elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, there are sort of two things to think about. I mean, number one, tax. I mean, Megan's absolutely right. If you think about the changes we've seen the tax regime over the last 10, 15 years, it's always hitting landlords. If you want to increase your portfolio as a landlord, you've got the extra stamp duty you've got to pay. If you're trying to run a business where you're not even treated as a business by the revenue, you're treated as someone who can never make a loss. So losses are difficult to carry forward. We've lost the writing down allowance, the fair wear and tear. There's been all sorts of things hitting landlords over the course of the last few years. And the biggest one, of course, was this mortgage interest thing. You can claim your basic rate, but you can't claim it against your higher rate. So I think the government's got to decide what it wants. If it really wants to get rid of the private rented sector, carry on with what they're doing. Keep hitting the private rented sector. My problem, though, is I think the private rented sector now is too big to fail. I mean, if we go back to the last year to which full figures are available, 2020, 4.4 million homes were in the private rented sector. That was almost 20% of people living in this country. If you take forward to a couple of years ago, you throw in the social sector, it's a third of people are now renting their homes. So I would say probably we've got to a stage where I think the private rented sector is too big to fail, and we've got to make ourselves heard. We've got to express to the government that we are providing good homes, we're providing a service, we are housing the population of this country, and we need a little bit of support. We are not simply the whipping boy that government can turn to every time it wants to raise a bit more money, to spend money somewhere else. So all those things we've got to focus on, really. And I welcome anything like an open letter. I welcome people writing to their MP, writing to local councillors, making our voice heard. But we need to think about supporting landlords. Now, one of the things that came up in the so-called white paper was a possibility of a housing court. It works really well in Scotland. So I'd love a housing court in this country. But students, the way we treat students, at least in the white paper, is absolutely crazy. We are going to carve out, if Michael Gove has his way, a different type of tenancy of students in student accommodation. Well, most of us who do this job on a regular basis know that students aren't in purpose-built accommodation for most of their time at university. They're with us. They're in the private rented sector. Mm-hmm. So, why on earth do we have different types of tenancy depending on the type of property a student happens to occupy? So, again, these are all things that, the Joint Committee with ARLA, with the National Landlords Association, they're all considering, which is why I think it's very wrong now to try and anticipate what the final form of the Renters Reform Bill will be, because hopefully everything we're doing, I mean, things like the Goodlord open letter, hopefully it will get through to the Michael Goves of this world and to our new housing minister. So, watch this space. There will be an awful lot of misinformation out there. I usually say it comes from the Sunday supplements. And I think the important thing that we as an industry have to do is not just lobby government, but we also have to start educating our landlords. Landlords should come to us. We're the experts. The agents are the people who know what's going on, and they should really be the centre for a landlord's focus when they want to know what's happening out there and what's likely to happen, in the 6 months, 12 months ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Sarah, could we jump? I'm having trouble getting onto the next slide. Can we just jump onto the next slide, please? Okay, super. Sorry. Sorry, that was the slide I've been trying to share. So yeah, this was the point suggested by agents in the open letter, and again, I think Robert's just covered quite a lot of the ground sort of suggested here. But there was, and there is a point around pets as well, isn't there? Which I know has been upsetting some people. Do you want to just mention that one, Robert?
Yeah, pets. If you go back to the consumer legislation we have from 2015, I mean, basically what that says is every clause in any agreement signed by a consumer must be fair, it must be reasonable. And of course, that's been interpolated into short-hold tenancies, which means, yeah, every clause in your AST must be fair because you're dealing with a consumer by definition there, the tenant is going to be their home. And one of the things that have come up fairly regularly are pets. Now, most of us say, you can't have pets. In the good old days, before we had the tenant fees ban legislation, if somebody wanted a pet, we would simply increase the deposit. Well, of course, that option is not available to us now. So now what we tend to say is if you want a pet, we're going to put the rent up. And that extra margin on the rent will offset the risk of damage by the pet, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there is a move from various organisations favouring dogs and cats to say, well, that in itself is a bit unfair. Why should somebody, a tenant with a pet, pay more rent? Well, our response is, well, because it's likely to cause damage. What Michael Gove suggests in his white paper is that insurance might be one way around this. Now, where this makes it into the famous rental reform bill, I simply do not know. But the suggestion, if we go back to last June, was you should have a right to have a pet if you're a tenant, but you as a tenant need to then take out some sort of insurance to cover against the additional damage that pet might do to the property. And of course, the beneficiary of that insurance policy would be the good old landlord. Now, that's got all sorts of implications about insurance premiums, things in the tax you pay on insurance, and of course, under the tenant fee ban legislation, because at the moment, you cannot charge a tenant for that sort of insurance premium. So if Michael Gove has his way and he wants to sort out pets and give tenants this absolute right to have a pet subject to insurance, he's going to have to go back to Parliament and change the tenant fee ban legislation to make that premium a legitimate expense and not an unlawful payment. So again, there's an awful lot about this, which to my mind means that we're not going to get this legislation easily through Parliament. Even if they started today, it's still a year away. But Michael Gove is talking about publishing the bill at the end of the year. So, watch this space. But that's what the government thinking is on pets at the moment. We should all have a pet. Yeah. But if you want a pet, you might have to take out extra insurance to benefit the landlord.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Question actually on the chat from wondering whether there will be any changes expected around the tenancy deposit schemes in the rental reform. Anything flagged there?
No, I mean, if we turn the clock back 5 years, government was very, very keen on having a single deposit which would follow a tenant from property to property to property to property. Now, that seems to have died a death. And in the white paper, there was a paragraph in which Michael Gove was saying that he thinks the industry has risen to the challenge because, of course, we now have insurance policies that will provide that deposit. So at the moment, there is no talk in the white paper about changing the way deposits operate. Yeah, we will still have that limit depending on how much rent you're paying. We're not going to go back to the days where, the deposit could be anything at all. So probably no change on deposit. But again, we just don't know, but probably no change on deposits.
Yeah. Okay, so just moved on to the next slide here. So what this one was looking at was just perceptions from agents and landlords around, first of all, house prices. Secondly, the amount of landlords coming into the market. Thirdly, what's happening to agent fees, and fourthly, what's happening to rent arrears. And I think this data really shows signs of the pressures on the market because the vast majority of poll respondents expect house prices going up. Vast majority expect the number of landlords to decrease. Management fees are expected to go up, possibly as regular agent optimism. I'll ask Megan a bit about that in a moment. But also expecting tenants to be struggling to pay their rent. So again, majority of people expecting the cost of living crisis to be really impacting rent arrears. So, Megan, what do you make of these pie charts?
I think I align pretty closely with them all. The interesting one is around management fees, because we have, over the last few years, had to reduce our management fees. That we all pushed them up after the Tenant Fee Act came in. And obviously over the years where supply has become lower, we have had to reduce them back down. But interestingly, as agents, 1 minute we're having to act as immigration, and then we're having to act as energy efficiency, such a massive scale of scope in that. And then in the middle of that, we have to understand all of these changes and all of these issues. So it's no surprise we deserve the higher fees, to be perfectly honest, although I'm sure Joe Bloggs and the public would not agree with that. Landlord volumes, I think that's safe to say. We're all seeing it, the stock overall. I think locally for me it was 39%, but I think you put in the open letter it was 46% across the country, which is pretty damning in itself. Naturally, rents are going up. We're all seeing it. It's probably a positive from a landlord's, but we're also seeing it becoming quite a sore subject. And with that, obviously, comes with the fear of making sure tenants can afford the properties, and are we protecting our landlords against tenants that maybe are earning the same salary but maybe paying an extra £200 a month more in bills?
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Absolutely. And are you seeing signs of the rent arrears going up already, or is that more of a forward-looking expectation?
I think more of a forward-looking expectation. We've made a massive push ourselves to ensure that we've got a robust rent and legal protection in place for a lot of our clients, and we're seeing a huge take-up of that, which I think is showing that people are a little worried about what's going to happen. Actually, as an office, we're not doing too bad on the arrears front, but it is a fear for us, certainly in the future, definitely.
Yeah, and certainly we're seeing the rent protection products that obviously we provide, proving more popular than ever at the moment, because it just provides that level of protection. I think this is a common, widespread worry, and when you're worried, insurance is one of the ways to sleep peacefully at night, isn't it? And I might just jump on one more slide here, and this just looks really at the Goodlord rental index, which is what we see is happening to rents over the last couple of years by region across England, and the headline here is that these numbers have gone up by about 20% over the last 2 years. So typical rents are 20% higher over the last year. So that speaks to some of the pressures around rent arrears, speaks to, as you said, Megan, actually from most letting agents' point of view, the fees they're earning are going up in line with that too. But obviously one has to ask yourself, how long does this continue? Okay, so I think I might move us on to thinking about what would we be advising landlords here. So we'll jump on a slide, please. And one of the things we need to be talking about here is the decent home standard. Robert, I might just ask you to elaborate a bit more on what that involves.
Yeah, most people in the private rent sector haven't come across that decent homes standard before. It was brought in years ago for properties in the public sector, local authority properties, housing associations. And what it did is it brought into play a set of slightly higher standards for an individual home than we have in the private rented sector. Yeah, in the public sector, you've still got things like Section 11 obligations, all the things you've got to repair. You've still got the health and hazard rating system, which is applicable right the way across the industry. But in the public sector, the social sector, if you like, there was an understanding that your facilities in the property should be reasonably modern, for example. So, if you have a kitchen which is more than 20 years old, that might be suspect. If you've got a bathroom more than 30 years old, that might be suspect. And there's a whole list of things. Now, what Michael Gove said in his white paper is he saw no reason why this slightly higher expectation in the public or the social sector should not now apply to the private sector. Then on the 2nd of September, the government announced a whole review of the decent home standard. So when the new standard for public or social properties is published sometime in 2023, watch out, because in the reform bill, when we see it, we could see a situation where those standards in the public sector are now put on to the private sector. Now, there's a slight irony in all of this because, I mean, some of you may remember the tragic death of the toddler in Rochdale last summer. It was a property which, I've only saw the photographs. The property was absolutely appalling. It had mold everywhere. The family had complained, nothing been done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And initially, when you read the news reports or you read your Sunday supplements, you thought, oh my God, this is another Rackman landlord out there. But say the irony of the situation was that was a property owned by a housing association in the public sector or the social sector, and the decent home standards did apply to that property in which the toddler died. I don't think there was any love lost between our industry and the media, but eventually people did acknowledge that it wasn't the private rented sector that was owning that property, it was the public sector. But that's the sort of emotion you get around this topic. So I can see a situation, and yes, we are going to have a scenario where the decent home standards in its new form, whatever that might be, is going to come to a property in your portfolio fairly shortly. Now, if it does, and you have got landlords who've got very old kitchens, very old facilities, very old bathrooms or whatever, yeah, they might be hit with yet another bill to start upgrading what's in their property. But, until we know what the new standard's going to say, until we actually see the bill and we know it's going to be given to us in the private rented sector, again, it's nothing to panic about. But, the message here has got to be, I'm afraid, that crappy properties, as I sometimes say, do usually attract crappy tenants, and landlords have got to understand that if they want the best returns on their property, they've got to invest. And that is not just in buying another property, that means in looking after the stock you've got and making sure they are decent in the widest sense, for homes in the 21st century. So that's all I'm going to say on the decent home standards, but watch this space again, wait for the bill, I'm afraid, William.
Very helpful, thank you. What about one of the key questions for many landlords, which is capital growth? Megan, if I was one of your landlords, how would you be advising me?
I think that's a very good question, William. How would I advise you? I think it's a really difficult one because at the moment, capital growth is, over the last 100 years, if we look at property, it has increased. Rents are at an all-time high. And I think it really depends on that particular landlord. And I think we briefly touched on this off air about the different types of landlords that we work with. So, for example, here we like to categorize our landlords. So we've got accidental landlords, pension landlords, and portfolio landlords. Now, the advice that I'm going to give one of those landlords is going to be different. Accidental landlords, obviously, at the moment are very fearful. They don't really want to be here. They don't want to be part of this party. We all barely want to be at this point. But the important thing for them is making sure that they're able to offload their assets in a really safe way, that they're not out of pocket. Now, it is at times tricky to then expand your portfolios because obviously interest rates are so high at the moment. But with that, we're hoping to see a dip down in house prices for sales. Sorry, I shouldn't have said hope. I'm a letting agent. I can't help it. But the more we can get more in, the better it will be for everybody. But that's really the best things we can hope for. One thing I just wanted to add on to the decent home standards point that Robert made, I think the word that I kept hearing was might. And the big problem we have is that even the current decent home standards policies that are in place are so vague and so unhelpfully clear that we just need clear guidance. Letting agents are sticklers for detail, and we want to know exactly what that means. Is your kitchen over 20 years old? We have a problem. We want that clear definition. And I think we as agents have to push back on that and say, look, we need a clear definition of how many people can live in this property to make it safe, all of these things. So, but I welcome safer housing. I think it's good. I think that as long as we're not being compared to social housing, and the same that we have recently, we're not social housing, they could barely support it themselves. So let's see if we can get some clearer guidance.
And what about the mortgage outlook at the moment? How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, we're starting to see it soften back down from what I can tell. I'm not a mortgage specialist, so I'm not going to pretend that I am. But from where we were pre-Christmas to where we are now, it's certainly looking more positive. But we can't sustain this level of pressure on the interest rate. So it's something that has to give. Now, that affects landlords, but it also affects homeowners. And of course, all these people that they want to buy their first home with. they can't afford to. So irrespective of what pressures they're putting on our landlords, they're not helping first-time buyers either. So something has to give.
Yeah, very interesting. And of course, Robert mentioned earlier the sort of 300,000 number around house building targets, but that seems a long way away from reality at the moment, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, Robert. I was just about to say, I was just going to add as well that one of the big fights that we're having at local level is that people want more housing, but they're also fighting to protect their green space. So we're sort of in this position where you're like, okay, you want somewhere for your family to live, but you don't want to give up green space. So it's like a balance, isn't it?
And Robert?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add something to that. I don't know how many people on this webinar are into HMO territory, but one thing which councils are beginning to do across the country are reclassify HMOs. So one of my favourite authorities down where I'm in Hampshire is Portsmouth. So what Portsmouth have started doing is looking at all the HMOs. And if you have an HMO, we say, 5 bed sits inside the HMO, what they've started doing in the last year or so is reclassifying each of those 5 bed sits in one HMO as a separate unit, as a separate property. They then banned each of those rooms as a band A for council tax. And all of a sudden, statistically, where they had 1 property before, they now technically have 5 properties tomorrow morning, which increases their council tax take. But more importantly, as far as government is concerned, all of a sudden we've got an extra 4 properties in the borough, which is absolutely fantastic for statistics. But of course, it doesn't actually change the number of properties that are available to tenants to rent. And that is happening across the country now. So just be wary if you are into HMO territory and you get a call from your local valuation officer, that's probably what they're going to be doing.
So we've got a couple of questions around rent reviews and increases. One from Mo Sedera around, have you got any advice around how to handle a rent increase for housing benefit tenants whose tenancy has become periodic after 12 months? And the other one, just a question around, have rent reviews always been in tenancy agreements, or is that a new thing? Robert, I might get you to lead off on that.
Yeah, if I start off on that, I mean, a lot of people watching this will have a fairly standard tenancy agreement from Goodlord or from ALA or whatever. Many standard agreements now will have an automatic rent review clause. Now, there are 3 ways to increase rent. Either you rely on your tenancy agreement, and if you have a clause in there, that's the way you've got to go. If you don't have an automatic increase clause in your tenancy, you've got to wait to the end of the fixed term, and either you then renegotiate the whole package, where you renegotiate the rent, or you serve this thing called a Section 13 notice, which you can do once a year, but you can't do it during a fixed term. You've got to wait till the fixed term is up. Now, the problem with the Section 13 notices is up to the landlord to specify the rent he wants in a month's time, the new rent. But on the back of the form, it tells the tenant all about their ability to appeal to a first-tier tribunal to get that rent reviewed. And what a first-tier tribunal can do quite legitimately is say, oh, we don't think this is a market rent for the property, even though rents may have gone up, may have gone down in your area, and they will impose on the landlord and the tenant a new figure. Well, going before a rent tribunal or first-tier tribunal is time-consuming, it's not cheap, and the worst thing comes to the worst is you don't really know what your outcome is going to be. So for all those reasons, a lot of standard tenancies now have an automatic rent review clause in there. You can have any formula you like to assess the new rent. You can say a market rent, but that raises the question, what is a market rent? Typically, you'll have RPI or CPI in there, so you know what the percentage is from the government department, and you simply apply that, write a letter, and that's the new rent, as long as you're following the letter of your rent review clause. Now, that's fairly standard. There wasn't a great deal in the white paper about going forward, but what Michael Gove thinks should be in the future is the inability to raise rent more than once every 2 years. So that's a different scenario than what we have now, because at the moment you simply raise rent in accordance with your clause, if there is a clause. If it says every month, every 6 months, every year, that's what it says. If it's not in the tenancy, a Section 13 notice every year. But that may change if Michael Gove sees his proposals through all the way to the Renters Reform Bill.
Very helpful. And Megan, anything to add, or any advice around how you'd advise the landlord to handle housing benefit tenants on a period who've moved on to a periodic?
I think Robert's kind of summarised it. I think it's a very delicate situation that you have to handle there. It's interesting, Robert, one thing that I had personally flag up, which I'd be really interested to know your view on, is that when there's been an RPI increase, obviously RPI, it's set where it goes, we don't control that. But we had situations where they didn't use their RPI increase and then 2 years later wanted to, and it was so far off where the current market value was. So it's a very difficult place to sit, isn't it? So what would be your advice in that situation?
I would always compromise for a couple of reasons. Number one, to see your tenant go and check in, find another tenant is time-consuming and costly. So from a landlord's point of view, you've got to be reasonable. The other thing is, if you go back to when the legislation for ASTs was first introduced, all the way back in 1988, the tribunal always has the ability to intervene if someone is paying more than the market rent. So in theory, even if you insist on a whacking great big rent increase, it's possible that if you're way out of kilter with the market, you're way above the market, your tenant could take you anyway to a first-tier tribunal, if they took advice from a CAB or a lawyer who knew what they were talking about. So I think from a landlord's point of view, you've always got to be reasonable. It's better to have a tenant paying slightly less, but someone you trust and the rent's coming in, than pushing it and pushing it and pushing it into an area where we come back to the side, tenant affordability. If they really can't afford it, all you're doing is creating a hole later on. And if you think about it, your typical possession case to get somebody out of a property is going to be £1,500, £1,600. That's a lot of rent to negotiate over, but it's what you might be facing as a landlord if they simply can't afford to pay it, despite what they may say on day one. The other issue, of course, with housing benefit claimants is the local housing allowance. Every local authority will have scales. So if you're saying I'm entitled to a 10% increase and that takes you way outside the local housing allowance, what's the point? All you're doing is creating a problem further down the line. So, you've got to know your tenants, you've got to know your local authority, you've got to know what's achievable, and ultimately you've got to explain to the landlord what the risks are of pushing it beyond what perhaps, you, Megan, and I might say is a reasonable increase.
That was an interesting point about the local housing allowance as well, because I urge anybody who's listening to this call, if you have not looked at your current local housing allowance versus market rent, it will absolutely blow your mind. It is shockingly completely out. I think Reading's around 30% out. So it's scary.
Really good point, Megan. Yeah. So we've got three more things to cover. So let's turn to the next slide, which is really about how to adapt your agency to protect against some of these pressures. We've got, I think, 3 points on the slide. Megan, do you want to kick off on this one?
Absolutely. So we covered about keeping up to date and informed. I think Robert briefly touched on it earlier. Us as agents, we need to become the experts in this. And whilst we call ourselves the experts, are we actually making sure that we understand that? We put here about being a good partner for a landlord. That also filters back down to your team. So if your team are not equipped to deal with questions from landlords, we have an obligation to them. We want to keep this sector alive. We want to continue working in the jobs that we hope to do. I hope everyone's the same. But the problem is, if you can't have a conversation with a landlord at whatever level you are in the business, then you're going to continuously plant seeds of negativity or worry with them. So, for example, here we made an FAQ for internal use where they're able, with all the answers to what possibly could come up from the renters reform, so that they could confidently answer that. Obviously, you can engage with things like Goodlord for CPD. You've got the NRLA and, of course, Property Mark. You can use those bits of information to ensure you're always up to date.
Yeah. And in terms of proving a good partner for your landlords, helping them understand these issues, that's really a frontline requirement. That's where the relationships are, isn't it? How are you thinking of that, Megan?
I think if you can't have a conversation with people easily, then you're going to have problems. Now, I kind of think that it's an opportunity when there's big legislative changes with in the industry, that actually it sometimes sends shockwaves through our landlords, and actually it's our time to shine. It's our time to kind of get them in a cuddle and say to them, right, we're going to look after you, we're going to make sure this happens. So it leads in really beautifully to making sure that your team are fully trained and ready for that conversation, and making sure that tenants are fully educated too, because I'm sure I'm not alone here when I've said how many tenants have rung up and said, well, the law says I can have a dog now. And I go, whoa, no, it doesn't. But the amount of times I've had people go, oh, Megan, can they have a dog? Are they allowed to have a dog now? So it's just making sure that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. And then this issue around the business model needing to be reviewed, especially in London. Robert, maybe just summarise what the key issue there is.
Yeah, well, some of you may have missed it, but one thing the white paper suggested is we get rid of fixed term tenancies. Now, there's a certain logic about this, because you think about it, if you can't serve a Section 21 to get your tenant out, what's the point of having a fixed term from the 1st of January, 31st of December? Nothing's going to happen at the end of that tenancy because tenant will still be there, it'll roll over. So Michael Gove's brilliant idea is to get rid of fixed term tenancies altogether. In other words, the moment your tenant moves in, he's effectively on what you and I might call a rolling periodic tenancy that goes from month to month to month to month until the second coming. Now, there are a lot of implications about this. I mean, number one, it's a difficult thing for landlords to get their mind around, because traditionally landlords start a tenancy on day one and finish it, a year later, whatever it may be. But a lot of agents too, they try and, or they actually do, invoice commission to a landlord for all the commission they would earn during the fixed term. So give you a crass example. You have a 12-month tenancy. How many London agents in particular will send out an invoice for 12 months commission in that first month? Yes, it makes it a very difficult month for your landlord. He's getting no income at all. But from a cash flow point of view, for agents to do that is fantastic. You're effectively getting 12 months fees in month one. Absolutely brilliant. Well, if we do get rid of fixed term tenancies and we have a rolling model from month to month to month, and your tenant can go at any time by giving you just 2 months notice, how many landlords are going to happily pay 12 months commission when, according to what they read in the Daily Mail, the tenant might be gone in 2 months' time? So that is going to take some thought if indeed these proposals make it into the reform bill. The other thing to think about is, as an industry, we actually get quite a bit of money out of charging landlords for renewals. End of a fixed term, and what do? We negotiate a new tenancy, or as Megan said, we negotiate a rent increase, and we charge the landlord accordingly. Well, again, if we don't have a beginning, a middle, and an end, we don't have a fixed term tenancy, just this rolling periodic thing, no one's going to ask us to do a renewal. So again, it's going to be something to think about in terms of cash flow. If we're not doing renewals, that could hit fee income. If we're not getting commissioned on 12 months let up front, that's going to hit cash flow. So we need to start thinking about this really the moment we see the shape of the new reform bill. But, we're going to think about other rental income, other sources of income. And, we've got down here rent protection, legal insurance. And I think you're quite keen on that, Megan, aren't you?
I think I could be the biggest fan of legal protection, but I don't think I'm alone from what I can gather. It's worth its weight in gold. I literally don't think we could exist without it at the moment. We've had, interestingly, a claim from one of these online TV ad ones, which was really cheap recently, and it's not going well for them. It's really not. So making sure you've got a robust rent and legal protection, and it's not just about the rent. In fact, I think the legal protection is actually sometimes more important than the rent protection. It was interesting you touched on renewal fees there, because one of the biggest concerns that came out of the renters reform white paper was that we would have that, because we as an agency have obviously taken the Tenant Fee Act, and we've had to almost spread some of that around to try and mitigate that. And renewal fees is definitely an area for us that's been the case. Interestingly, though, where are we at? We're going to end up with a situation where we're back in the 80s, where landlords would rather properties sat empty than rent their properties out, which is completely ridiculous that we're in that position. Whereas they might go traveling for 12 months, and we could put somebody in a home for 12 months. So there has to find a balance somewhere. But yeah, I really would say to you guys, if you haven't got someone providing you rent and legal protection, you need to.
Well, Megan, do send me your bank details later. I couldn't have really bettered myself. So just before we wrap, let's just talk about some of the positives coming out of the changes. I think we'll just jump on to the next slide, please, Sarah. This first point really is if we're to believe what we see in the press, although obviously we wouldn't believe what we see in the Daily Mail, would we, Robert? Then there are landlords leaving the market. There'll be fewer landlords. Megan, what are you seeing on that in that front?
I think we sort of touched on it briefly earlier, that the accidental landlords are the ones that are most likely to be leaving, probably already maybe have gone. When they did stamp duty relief, that was a good time for them to exit the market. Interestingly, we talked about this before, about fewer landlords but larger portfolios. Now, my only downside is that when you have got professional landlords, they're more driven by the kind of pounds and pence of everything, which sometimes you think, oh, is that going to work against me? But I do think that when landlords are in that position, they are more likely to use, they're going to be more worried about who they're going to use as their agent, who they're going to spend their money on. So again, this is an opportunity for you as really good agents, the fact that you're sat on a call like this and you're working on your own development. I think it will come into our own, and we'll see a reduction in the kind of crappier letting agents out there, the sort of ones that give us all a bad name. And it will be our chance to kind of rise to the top.
Yeah. Great, and there are other opportunities too here, aren't there? And I know you've been doing a little bit of matchmaking, can we call it?
Yeah, so we've got a project here that we're working on called the VIP landlords. So when we have, say, an accidental landlord that wants to leave the portfolio, we've got a pool of people that we've qualified and we have got ready to kind of sweep in and buy those properties and feed them straight back into our portfolio. So rather than them going to the open market straight away, we give them about a 10-day time in that. It means that landlords often try and sell them with tenants in situ. So it means that the landlord's getting no void periods. The new landlord's going to get no void periods. And of course, we're benefiting from not losing a property out of our portfolio. Now, obviously, if the property is going to be empty, then obviously the open market is where we've got to go. We've got to be opening up to all the different opportunities. But it is a moment where you can obviously add another landlord in, ensure you're not going to lose out of the portfolio. But of course, if you're working with any ancillary products like mortgages and conveyancing, it's another opportunity there.
Absolutely. And all these things represent change, don't they? And I certainly think one of the things that we put a lot of store by at Goodlord is that we view it as our job to be on top of that change and to make sure that we're helping our agencies through that and making sure that the software we build is ready for that change and keeping people compliant. And I think that for agencies, I think we would say, look, these changes are a time to rethink and a time potentially to upgrade and to sort of embrace some of this new technology. But we are not the only rent tech supplier, much as it annoys me sometimes. But I would say, as long as you've got suppliers who are committed to supporting you, being compliant, staying on top of all the regulatory changes, then they will be your partners and they will help manage this process. There is also probably a shift here towards being more fully managed, isn't there? With to help look after these changes and stay on top of things. Are you seeing that, Megan? It's taking foot yet?
Well, yeah, already actually. Interestingly, our take on 70% at the moment are automatically fully managed. Yeah. I'm sure I'm not alone when I say that our self-managed landlords are often the ones that get stuck in the legislation trap, where they're not maybe fully up to date, or they maybe only understand part of it. Now, there are obviously a good 100,000 of those that are currently with the NRLA, but there's also a good chunk of them that are not with any form of professional body or agent. So I think making sure that you're the expert on that, as I said multiple times before, let them come to you, let them talk to you and explain the benefits, because whilst it might not be a full managed option, you've also got, rent collection models. Making sure you're working with the right landlords will make sure that your teams aren't pushed to absolute breaking point as well. So it's a win-win for everybody.
Absolutely. And talking of the professionals and regulation, that brings up ROPA, doesn't it? And Robert, maybe just give us your final thoughts for this as we close the session on what ROPA and the professionalising.
Yeah, I mean, ROPA's a bit on the back burner at the moment. It came in a couple of years ago with a big fanfare. We're going to have more professional agents. They're going to have to get examination, qualifications, etc., etc. We'll all have the badge. We'll all be regulated. Hasn't really happened. I think Michael Gove's focus has probably shifted in the last 2 years, but it is still there. And I, as a professional in the industry, I would welcome ROPA for all the reasons you can imagine. it will scream that we are a profession, not simply a service industry. So hopefully it'll happen, but I'm afraid, William, at the moment it's on the back burner. Just, again, watch this space.
Okay, very good. So let's just jump finally to how everybody on the call can help. Sarah, if we could have the final slide, please. We're still taking signatories. If you check out our Newsagent blog on goodlord.co, you will see you can still sign up to our open letter. If you can capture your screen here, there's a QR code where you can jump straight through it. Feel absolutely free to email it with a cover note to your local MP, or for that matter, go and visit your local MP. They will run drop-in sessions. Do feel free to bring up some of these points with your local representative. Of course, you can post on social media. That's all very helpful. Helps raise awareness. Helps people understand some of the issues and pressures going on, and how things that help tenants actually can backfire and put more pressure on the sector, and ultimately cause more stress and pressure on tenants. Absolutely build relationships with your local journalists. Not many journalists follow the sector as keenly as those of us on this webinar, and help them understand what's happening, help them understand what's affecting your area. But I'm going to wrap up there. This has been a very helpful hour. It is part of everybody's continuous professional development, and those of you still on the call will get the certificates for that in a few weeks' time. And I just want to say thank you very much to our guests, Robert and Megan, who've been terrific, really helped shed some light on some of these issues. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.